the stigma needs to disappear, because this is a subject that really needs to be studied. Because if you make the assumption of the possibility that UFOs could be our chance at first contact, right, with another intelligence, where it comes from, we don't know. It would be sad that it's not the scientific world that's involved in that, and that instead it might be the military world.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Minds Against Dogma, the podcast. I am very excited about this episode and my guest today, because first is a topic that's so hot right now in the media, and also it begins to be covered in the scientific community as well, is the topic of unidentified anomalous phenomena, which used to be called unidentified aerial phenomena, which used to be called the UFOs. And we're going to speak a little bit about how we got to the new nomenclature. But most importantly, it's because I have a guest who has been working and doing research in this field for a very, very long time. And he's published recently a book about the scientists' view of the UFOs, what we know and what we don't know. And we're going to talk in detail about the book, but also an article that I want you to see for a very, very long time, an article that looks at all the evidence coming from databases and reports of unidentified flying objects. But this time, looking at the data in a very rigorous scientific manner, and trying to isolate the variables, trying to find the properties of this unidentified aerial phenomena. So I would like to say hi to Robert Powell. Hi, Robert.
Hi, Sinziana. It's good to see you again. It's been a couple of years since we last talked.
Yes, it's been a couple of years. So just a little bit of the backstory here. In 2022, I was consulting for, my company was consulting for a company that was interested in the science of propulsion systems, but most importantly, something that has to do with warp drives. And at first, I was consulting on the material science part, but then I was asked to look at some of the claims that the company was investigating in terms of warp drive physics. And I have to admit that I got into the field reluctantly, like many of us do actually. And but after a while, I found some very interesting questions and some very interesting physics there that needs to be explored, and some very interesting events that need to be addressed. So while I diverged from the UAP in terms of the data analysis and became what I now call an expert on how not to build a warp drive, I was lucky to be at a conference organized by the SCU, the Scientific Coalition for Unidentified Phenomena, that Robert actually founded. And at that conference, I was lucky to meet a few people that were doing real research in the field. A few people like, for example, big shout out also to Ryan Graves, one of the people who brought the attention to this field and to the accounts, the first accounts that the pilots are seeing. So it was one of the reasons why we now take this field more seriously. But I spoke with Robert for many hours after every day of the sessions, having coffees at midnight, and trying to understand all the aspects of what this type of research entails, because it's not just about the physics, it's also a lot of behavioral science involved, and it's also a lot of data science and chemistry and biology and psychology. So Robert, you worked for a very long time as a chemist and a biochemist, and also as an engineer in the corporate world, in the industry, in different fields. You are part of the teams that were building the memory that we now use in the flash drive. You did a lot of research on nanotechnology and atomic physics as well. So what brought you to the field of UFOs?
Well, that's a good question. So, when I was a teenager, I had read a book by Dr. Alan Hynek called The UFO Experience, and I found it valuable, and it seemed like there was something to the subject, that it wasn't just, craziness, for example. So but I put that book aside because, right, I had to go to college, get married, raise a family, get a job, all of those things you do in life. And I didn't have time to really study UFOs at that point. But then I worked in the semiconductor field, and I was fortunate in that I was able to retire early. So I retired when I was 53, and I made this list. Okay, what do I want to do with the rest of my life, right? And so one of the things on my list was go back and check out that subject, UFOs. And so that's what I did. And as I began to study it more and more, it became clear to me that there was something to the subject. It wasn't just people imagining things. And so that's what really got me going 17 years ago, studying the UFO subject, which we now call UAP.
Which is an interesting point, because in the book, and if you allow me now to actually share the book cover, so for the people to see what we are talking about. So this is the cover of the book. A scientist explains what we know and what we don't know about the UFOs. I hope you can see it. So this is the book, and I found it very interesting. I find that it complements very well also the article that we're going to talk about in a second, because on that article, you look at all the databases starting from 1947 to 2016, and with a team of people by hand, basically looking at the correlations and trying to find what's the reliable data that we can then look at and try to categorize by shape and by size and by all these other properties that we are interested in. In the book, you also talk about, for example, how to use language processing and AI to look at this type of data. And also in the book, you talk more about the high strangeness situations and how you actually went in the field and look at some of this data. And I just want to briefly go through just to give the viewers an idea. Please buy the book, read it for yourselves. I mean, I told Robert before the Zoom that we could have made an episode on any of these chapters, on every chapter. It's every chapter is very interesting to discuss in detail. So you start with the history of the UFO phenomenon. Then you look at how basically the humankind is dealing with this data, how strange the phenomenon is. And this is a very detailed discussion from the perspective of how we look at this data, what's our sensory perception, what happens when multiple people have the same account, and so on. Then you talk about the interesting properties from the perspective of physics and new physics. And then there are a couple of chapters about our challenges, like future outlook, what are the hypotheses and how we can actually study them. So it's a very, very interesting book to read, but just gonna stop the screen sharing now for a second. One of the things that was interesting to me at the beginning of the book, because this is basically part of your journey as well, like how you started, was when you looked at the MUFON website in 2007, I believe.
Right.
Because you were the research director there for like a decade. and you look at the website, and it was an opening position for a research director of research, and you were appalled to see that they wanted to know how where are they coming from, the UAPs, how they are
The propulsion, yeah.
and what do they want, what's their intention. And you were appalled, and you said that you actually are interested to see if there's any true evidence, but you applied nonetheless for the position, and you got it. And you were the director of research of MUFON for like a decade. So
Right.
that was an interesting perspective from my point of view, because it was exactly how a scientist would approach the subject. Let's first look at the evidence. And also you talk a little bit about how we got to name them UAPs, which, when you think about it, unidentified anomalous phenomena, and you give this example in the book, could be a Loch Ness monster. It's the
right. It could be it could be almost anything. And that's one of the things, Sinziana, that's strange about this whole subject, right? Because normally in science, you start from a broad, taxonomy, and you narrow it down as you become more specific. And we've gone the opposite direction, right? We started off with flying saucers, which is pretty specific. And then from flying saucers, it was, well, unidentified flying objects. So anything in the sky that was flying. And from there, we went to, unidentified aerial phenomena, which was, it could be a phenomena, it could be physical, but it was in the sky. And then they changed it within a year to unidentified anomalous phenomena. So now it could be anything from a sprite right up in the upper atmosphere to, I guess it might even could be Loch Ness monster.
Yeah, I mean that's what you're saying, and to be honest, is actually, to me, that was striking home, because I've seen this in my first field as well. Worm dark matter, at some point, due to some people's poor interpretation of the data and a list of logical fallacies, was covered in stigma, even though many of us knew that those claims are not true. And interestingly enough, some of the same people who were publishing these anti-worm dark matter, let's call it, articles, like a decade later, realized their mistake and started calling it something else. And they were calling it non-cold, but not hot, like worm, I guess. So I've seen this happen in my field as well, in which you stigmatize one field and then realize the mistake, but you have to start from something entirely different, so you call it something else just to get rid of the
this, yeah, and to get rid of the stigma. Now one thing that's important to note is how it went from the word UFO to the word UAP. So a guy by the name of Jay Stratton, who was the head of the UAP task force in the time frame of 2018, 2019, up until about 2021, he wanted to brief Congress on the status of this, of what the military's been seeing in the skies, the things that you talked about from Ryan Graves and that from Fravor, the commander of a squadron in 2004, had seen. But he knew that if he used the word UFO, there was so much stigma that they weren't going to listen to him, right? And he wanted them to have an open mind. So in order to do that, he changed the term to UAP, because that could encompass other things, right? Such as a drone, right? Like a Russian or Chinese drone, for example. So the way they got rid of this, or got around the stigma, was broadening the term, right? So that way, as long as it can mean these other things, then it's okay to listen to it, right? But if you kept it specific to something that's not of human origin, then you have a very big hill to climb in order to get someone to be open-minded and just listen to the information you have.
Yes, and then of course, because it wasn't just aerial, because people were seeing these things in the oceans and whatnot, it became anomalous basically to just keep the UAP, but add something else. So yes, because with everything that's happening now and with Congress paying attention and with all these kind of things, there are some initiative also in academia to start looking at this data. And as we discussed before, while I understand, for example, why they have to start from scratch, because such is the academic scrutiny in terms of publishing and having your paper reviewed. I just like you say in the book, I agree that we cannot ignore the evidence we have so far, especially because it's been spanning for like 70 years basically, and
Right.
It's when from all like 100,000, I think you say, witness accounts, you come with 301 reliable ones over 70 years. I mean, I don't see any project, be it at Harvard or anywhere else, that get funding for 70 years for seeing something like this, you know? I do understand and I'm very glad that they do this kind of things finally. So I understand their perspective, but we still have to look at this evidence. Even when they're going to come up with something or nothing, we have to compare it with what we have. And this was your challenge, basically, looking at all these accounts and trying to figure out, like, filtering them and see where it is that we can find reliable information. And tell us a little bit about how that works.
Sure. So one thing that became clear to me very early on when I entered this field was that there is a lot of noise. Uh, Most of your reports, 90% or more, are either misidentifications, a hoax, a witness who hopes or wishes this is what they see, right? Or there's just not enough information to make any kind of conclusion, right? So in this paper that you're referring to, that we worked on, myself and three other individuals, um, we took these 100,000 cases that existed over the last 70 years. The very first thing we did, and this is how we drove the numbers down to about 301. And you can see that's the paper that you have, that the audience can see now. And we took those 100,000 and we only took reports where there was an investigation. In other words, if a witness simply said, I saw this, I saw that, we didn't use it. There had to be a follow-up investigation and analysis of that report. So that whittled down the 100,000 very rapidly. After that, we had four basic criteria that we looked at. And before I go into the criteria, here's what we were trying to do, right? We wanted to have cases where the object was so close and there had been sufficient investigation that you were left with really one of two possibilities. Either the witness was lying or it actually happened. So we wanted to eliminate misidentifications in cases where there was not enough information. So once we looked for cases that had reports, we looked at the reliability of the observation. So the first criteria was that we had to have reliable observations. So we either wanted multiple witnesses or we wanted a single witness that was very strong, such as a physics professor or a pilot or a policeman. The second criteria was to ensure that the object was close to the witness. So we looked for an angular size in the atmosphere of at least 0.15 degrees. To give the audience a feel for that, if you're looking at the full moon is 0.5 degrees. And on the full moon, you can see a lot of detail, right? You can see the largest of the lunar plains and craters. So if an object was roughly 1/3 the size of a full moon or larger, then we would utilize that in our database. So that was one of the criteria we looked for. The third was that there's sufficient lighting, because we're wanting the witness to be able to see details on the object. So that means it's either a daytime sighting, or if it's a nighttime sighting, either the object has to be self-illuminating, or you have to have lighting, for example, from a city that lights up the object. And then the last criteria was sufficient detailed information. So that means the investigation that was done has to give you information such as approximate sizes, distance, such as it was right before the tree line, right? Something that we could measure against, or it was next to another object that you could compare. So that way we could ensure that we were at least in the ballpark of size for an object. And then what you have there is some of the characteristics and data we collected. So we collected, size, shape, approximate distance, lowest altitude that they'd seen the UAP. And once we did all this, we had 301 cases that came out of it. Now, there are definitely more than 301 cases out of the 100,000, but we preferred to throw a case out, right, than to keep cases that were not strong. So we erred on the side of keeping the strongest of cases. And what we did after that is this table that you're looking at now shows that out of 301 cases, 110 cases were the disk. That is the most common case throughout history. And that's what we originally called, of course, the flying saucer. And the second most common was the triangle. And that one really came into existence significantly in the 1970s and beyond. Prior to that, there were reports of triangles, but not very many. They were few and far between. And then, of course, the oval, which is really very similar to the disk, was the third largest type of shape that we came across. Now, what we did then, and I will kind of go to what you're showing on this slide, is those are all the other shapes. There were lots of different shapes, which is very interesting that there's so many different shapes. I mean, if you look at our own technology, right, you have jets, you have propeller planes, you have helicopters, you have balloons, but they're fairly limited. But the numbers of different shapes reported is striking. So the next thing we did is we actually made images of the most common shapes, the ones where we had the most reports. So those were the discs and the triangles.
I want to
go ahead.
Yeah, I want to interject here a little bit, because this is the difference between looking at this data and having in place all the filters basically that you did and all the criteria that you did to look at the data, and then is applications, for example, where people can just say, I spotted an UFO, this is how it looked like. And I remember at the conference, I was talking with some people who worked at, I think it's called the Enigma Lab. It was an app that just looked at, was gathering information from anyone on the planet who reported an UFO. And back then, so 2 years ago, they were telling me that actually one of the most common shapes that were reported were not discs. In fact, there were triangles or 3 lights. Now we know, for example, that if you look at a drone in the sky, that looks like, in the nighttime, that looks like 3 lights, right? So this is the difference between what's happening when you have this kind of popular culture, a first account of witnesses who just see something in the sky and don't pay much attention. And this is the difference when you look at all the databases. And by the way, you went through not just databases from nonprofits and so on, people who are interested in the subject, but also the military one and the project Blue Book and all this,
Right.
all these kind of things. So it was a very detailed analysis of the shapes. And you also, when you talk about the shapes in the article and also in the book, it's true that some of them, besides the fact that they're very varied, there are some of them that you can put in one category or the other, depending on your line of sight and the inclination of the object. And you let out a few of them that were not, they were like one-off. But in the book, and I would refer I would refer everyone to go and see the examples in the book as well, because you talk about that barbell. That's one of the very odd shapes that were reported, but because you didn't have so many, of course, you didn't include it in this type of analysis. So
Yes, the barbell is so rare, Sinziana, that the barbell is in miscellaneous. There, out of the 301 cases, there was either one or two barbell reports. I think there was just one. And those, I've actually gone and through all the databases that exist and looked for barbells. And out of, if you go through the entire database, you're up to several 100,000 reports. And there were a total, I believe, of maybe 50 barbell cases across that entire number. So it's an extremely rare type of report. But what's unusual about it is who would report a barbell? I mean, if you're going to make up a story, right, you're not going to make it up as a barbell. And what do we have in our skies that looks like a barbell? There's nothing we put up in the sky that looks like a barbell. So it's one of those that it's so strange, it makes you feel like there must be some validity to it. And I want to jump back for a moment to something you said. For example, Enigma saying they had a lot of triangles, right? And so if you take reports at night of the lights that people see, right? And you can't see the object itself, you just see the lights. Well, any three lights that you put up in the sky can form a triangle. So and especially if the witness has heard about triangles, it becomes very easy for them to say they saw a triangle anytime they see three lights in the sky.
yes, I had a first encounter with such a drone myself, so I know how misleading it can be. Very soon after me being at that conference, so I can tell you that I was suggestible to the phenomena. And yes, I realized, especially with the movement, because it had that type of like very, not very smooth movement, until I realized that they were basically landing the said drone on top of a building. So there was nothing extraordinary about that. So you were talking earlier when I interrupted you about how you reconstructed these shapes.
Right. So what we did is we looked at every individual case, and we looked at it because these are cases where the witness was quite close to the object, and so that they are able to give you a feel, for example, of the approximate diameter. And more important than the diameter, really, is the ratio of the diameter to the thickness, right? Because a witness might misinterpret how far away an object was and whether or not the object was small or large. But independent of whether it's small or large, its ratio of its diameter to its thickness is going to be constant. And so one of the most common discs, we found three different types of discs. And one was what we call the domed disc. Now, this disc was actually more common back in the 1940s and 1950s than it is today. but it was still is reported even today. And it basically has a ratio of about 2.5 to 1. So its thickness, the diameter is usually 2 to 3 times its the thickness of the craft. Now, the other thing that's interesting on this is there was a report done in the 1950s by the Battelle Institute. That's a famous scientific organization. I believe they're located in Ohio, at least they were back then. And they did the same thing as us. They filtered the data. They manually went through it. And their most common object, which I don't recall if I have it in this report, was the dome-shaped disc, and they drew an image very similar to the image that we have drawn here. And as far as I know, Battelle was the only other report done where they actually filtered the data. So some of your listeners may be familiar with a report that was published in one of the Nature magazines, which is a very, or not magazine, but journal, which is a very prestigious journal. And it was done by 2 University of Utah professors. And what they did is they took a database called the Newfork database, and they basically just took all the data in the database and they plotted it based on the state in which the sighting occurred. So the plus on that paper was that they got into a Nature journal, which is really good for this subject. The minus, though, was there was no filtering done, right? So when you report, when 90% of your data is garbage, and you report on that full database, well, your report is 90% garbage. All you can truly report on, if you're not going to filter, is you could say, this is where people live that do UFO or UAP reports, right? But it doesn't tell you anything about the UFO. It's only telling you something about the person that reports the UFO.
Yes, and this is something that I want to come back later on to, because it has to do with how you scale the data against your sample, and this has to do also with the time, the place, who is reporting the information, and so on and so forth. We can go a little bit through the data here, because I want to show the audience. So first of all, this is where you can find the paper. You can also find all the data, the information from the databases, and you can download it and you can analyze it yourself. So now you're looking at the extreme accelerations, the speed, and
right.
This is a table that basically says, well, for this shape, with these sizes and so on, what was reported? Was it extreme speed? Was it extreme acceleration? Was it hovering, which is something that's very interesting when we report this, when we see these reports, because it's hard to have both hovering and then extreme acceleration. And then
right.
Finally, whether it was anything anomalous from the point of view of electromagnetic radiation.
Yeah, in this, when we put this table together, there were several things or items that came out that we learned that we were not expecting to learn. One was related to electromagnetic emissions that you just mentioned. For anyone who's studied this subject in detail, they know that there are often reports where an individual is driving their car or their radio is turned on or what have you, and they're close enough to the object that there's some type of EM interference. So their car shuts down, their radio turns off, their lights go out, that type of thing. Well, when we did this, what we found was of our 33 cases of a triangular shaped object, none of those ever caused an EM event, such as, cars shutting down. Those were unique to the discs, cigar shapes, and the oval shapes. So that's something we had not expected. Another unique characteristic of the triangle was it was most often the shape that the witness said was stationary, not moving, and then suddenly begins to accelerate and goes out of sight within 2 to 3 seconds, which I can, it's basically trigonometry, but you can actually calculate minimum accelerations and velocities required, right, to go from an object that's making up, let's say, that's the size of the full moon, and then it begins to accelerate. And for it to disappear in 2 seconds, your G forces, you're in tens, if not hundreds of G forces for the object to go out of sight. So when you have that situation, the first thing you do is you say, okay, how could the witness perhaps have misinterpreted what they saw? So you look at, could it have gone behind a cloud? Was it a hazy day? Did it go behind another object? Did it somehow just disappear and not, accelerate? But once you've eliminated those possibilities, and you're left with a witness who you have no reason to doubt tells you in front of his eyes or her eyes that an object disappeared in 2 to 3 seconds, then you're talking about something that humans are not able to manufacture. That's well beyond our capabilities.
Yes, this is something that is very interesting to me, because this type of phenomena and this type of properties are basically constraining which type of physics can we look at, like what type of physics is it employed. And I'm going to be now the devil's advocate. We had this discussion before, so you were expecting me to say this now. But many times when we look at this type of phenomena, including what Commander Fravor was reporting, and again, in this particular study, you didn't have the raw radar data or the radar, recordings to see if, from the pilot's perspective, what was seen, and then compare it with what was actually on the radar. That's a project that I don't even want to think about how much red tape might involve. But when we see with the eye, and even with a camera or like any instrumentation, when we see something here and then appearing at a very high distance, almost instantaneously, or like in a few milliseconds, we assume that that is the same object. And that's one because we think about the motivation and all these type of things. We think like human, but humans also are not as efficient and as effective as we think we are, because we send a Tesla in space for no reason. So to me, that can also be an indication of having multiple objects, having a sort of cloaking mechanism, which we now know that even in our world and scientific research and industry, you look at this type of things like high refractive indexes and all these kind of things. So that becomes more of a possibility to have a cloaking device and then an uncloaking device at a certain distance. That's a possibility. I know it sounds counterintuitive to someone who sees it, because we are, making up for the
Right.
frames. That's what the mind does. But that's also something that that can be taken into account in terms of when we estimate the accelerations and the speeds and all that.
Visually, to the individual looking, that's always a possibility, right? That if you assume an object could cloak, then the individual might think it had begun to accelerate and suddenly disappeared, while it actually just cloaked and disappeared. But we also have 2 cases of radar data combined with visual observation of an object that indicates extreme acceleration. One case was in Stephenville, Texas, where we have a witness and radar data that coincide, and the acceleration based on the radar data was a minimum of nine g-forces, and that was an object that was sitting still in the sky. So we can't do even close to that, right? If you take an F-35, which would of course be very noisy if he was trying to hover, because his engine throttle is he has to go straight down. So an F-35, if it was hovering and then suddenly began to accelerate, could accelerate just barely above 1 g-force. A lot of people think a jet can do 7, 8, 9 g-forces, but that is linear. That's not linear acceleration.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right? Yeah, that is acceleration due to curvature and change of direction. But these objects on radar accelerated linearly at 9 g-forces. And another case we have was from the Project Blue Book days. And Dr. Claude O'Hare, a French physicist, actually did the calculations on that case. Now, this one, we have individual radar images because that's the way radar was captured back then. You didn't have digital data. Mm-hmm. And his calculations were in the neighborhood of 140 g-forces when the object moved from one side of the plane, to the other side of the plane. So there is radar data as well as witness data that indicates extreme accelerations.
If we... Sorry?
Yeah, one thing I wanted to mention, Sinziana, for your listeners, is that in that report, when it talks about the objects are silent, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
What many of the witnesses make note is when they say there was no noise, their language and the way they're saying that is not just there was no noise, it was like there's no noise and there should have been noise, right? They're close enough to this object that they know they should be able to hear it, yet they can't. And so that's different than if someone just says, I was observing an object and I didn't hear anything, right? Because maybe the object's too far away or some other, or maybe the object's a balloon. But when someone says, the objects, we know the object was close to them, and they say, I should have been able to hear it and I could not hear a thing. That really tells you a lot about what the witness is observing.
And especially because even sometimes you do say that there was a sort of a humming or something like that, depending. So right. It's always that no noise. But that's very interesting because, again, from our perspective and what we can do right now with our technology, we have, imagine accelerating such a jet with absolutely no noise, right? It's like, It's like there's the sonic boom and all this type of things. So, of course, we are tempted to think that it's a completely different type of propulsion if we don't hear anything. There's no, especially at those speeds and those accelerations. So that's a very important, variable that can constrain the physics that we should look into.
And right. All of the data seems to point to the object not interacting with the atmosphere.
Which I have an idea about, because that's another, and you explore it a little bit in a few chapters in the book. I want to talk a little bit about, yes, you talk here about the satellite images and all that. And again, as I said, everyone can download the data and look at this paper. I'm gonna stop sharing it for now. So for me, one of the most important things with this paper was the fact that we now have something to compare it with in terms of what properties to look at. Because before it could have been anything and everything everywhere all at once in the sky, right? Every object could have been a UFO. So, and as I discussed this also with Ryan and a few other people, this type of study, this type of topic of research and of field, we shouldn't approach it on very narrow niches and narrow subfields. If I look, for example, at warp drive physics and gravitational physics and dark matter and all these kind of things, I cannot ignore the fact that there's already some data that can help me constrain my model if I want to say, okay, maybe this is what UAPs are. The same thing with people who are looking at the witness account. And we need to take into account the behavioral aspect. And we need to do a lot of data science and data analysis to basically compare it with and scale it against many other things like prejudice and all this other stuff. If we look now from yes, of course we need to make better telescopes, and of course we have to have a better communication with the defense departments and the pilots and all these kind of things. But this is basically the type of field that we have to find correlations in between these subfields and these avenues of research. So for me, it was absolutely amazing when I saw this study. I was finally, there's something there that I can, find some correlations and build on top of that, and also then in a feedback loop constrain my model with what I see. And for me, this is very interesting, especially because you're going to work on a follow-up article and look at more data correlations. One of the things that we discussed last time, and this, I think for me, is one of the most interesting, but you do talk about it a little bit in the book, is the lensing phenomena or the bending of light phenomena. And that also is interesting because the anti-correlation with atmosphere, let's say, or like anti-interaction with the atmosphere does point towards something that's even stranger. So this type of warp drive effects. And lensing is something that would basically differentiate between a regular propulsion system and something that has that big a gravitational pull as to distort the space-time and then have this kind of light bending effects. And also, of course, the advantage of having such an warp drive would be, again, I'm talking here in theory, would be you don't have the noise. That's another thing. The acceleration, I mean, there have been these papers by Barcelo, who now looked at the warp drive possibility in 3D, because before, when they were looking at Alcubierre metric and all this type of metrics, they were impossible in 1D. And this is probably a topic for a different podcast on how all these things are different. But one solution is actually to first have a certain type of shape, and second, have this type of movement that looks chaotic, but it's not really. So for me, these kind of properties are very interesting to differentiate between a propulsion system that's still way more advanced than ours, but based on kind of the physics that we are building up to, and on the other hand, something that's completely different, like warp drive. So I'm looking for the follow-up paper.
Yeah, we're going to try to work on that one this year. So the one difference in the follow-up is that we will look at time and geographical location. So in addition to just the characteristics. So
yeah, this is something that's also very interesting, because you have here two variables. First, you can say that it's the geographical location is important from the perspective of where you are on the globe. the magnetic field, the gravitational field, and all these kind of things. But then it's also because of who are the people who are reporting this on the globe. And also on the, I want to ask you a little bit now about, in the book, you talk about using AI to look at this data and how you can use AI to basically analyze the language and remove the flowery words that some people use in describing a UFO and stick with the words that are more scientific or describing the phenomenon. And there are some interesting correlations there, because I remember when you were talking about how it spread during the day, and when you'd expect the most number of accounts to be, which is in the evening after people come back from work and they look at the sky and all that. Yeah. But then the AI found this correlation that was 5 a.m. and 6 a.m. in the morning. And for me, I cannot hope but think of how our suggestibility as human is in different times of the day. And who would report something like this? Like, what would be the sensory perception at 5 and 6 a.m. in the morning versus our perception at night? So this is yet another layer of variables that one needs to discuss and isolate and so on.
Right. So, I think that time was roughly about 2 to 3 a.m. in the morning. There's this, like, normally you have, as people go to bed at night, your number of reports decreases. But so you have this slope that drops like this, and then all of a sudden around 3 in the morning, it just pops up. So I don't know if that's, when the time of night when people have to go up and get up to go to the restroom or what, and so then they look outside and see something.
But I mean, if it was 3, I actually remember 5 and 6, but I may be wrong, like 5 and 6 a.m. in the morning. But if it was 3 a.m., it would actually make even more sense, because at 3 a.m., if you wake up from the sleep, that type of suggestibility, you can see anything. I mean, especially if you're close to somnambulism in your suggestibility, yes, those accounts are not necessarily, And then there are a couple of other things that you discuss in the book as well. For example, how memory works. And this is correlated to my other work in hypnosis and hypnotherapy and NLP and all that. We know that memory is not 100% accurate. It's deleted, is distorted, is generalized, is put already in the boxes that you have prepared for whatever topic you want to analyze. So that's also correlated with the other aspect that you discuss in the book, which is the time dilation or contraction, depending, but it was time dilation mostly in the book, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, human memory is definitely fallible, right? As I kind of mentioned in the book, if you were in a car wreck, you might not remember for sure, who was in the car with you, or what day it was, or what the color was of the other car that hit you. But one thing you will remember is that you were in the car wreck. So it's kind of the same thing in a UAP report. You may get the shape off slightly, or the time of day, or some of the events surrounding your sighting, but it's not likely that you will get the sighting itself wrong, right? Either you saw the UAP or UFO, or you didn't see it. But the first time I ran into problems with memory and witnesses was an interesting one. It was in the Stephenville case. I had gone down and interviewed a witness, and the witness told me these F-16s went by. After they went by, he later saw the UFO, right? So the media interviews him, and there's a different witness who says he saw jets chasing the UFO, right? So as time goes by, this constable who I'd interviewed, his story changed to where now the jets were chasing the UFO, right? And I know that wasn't something he did intentionally, but he heard other people say it, and then his memory changed. but the fact that he saw the UFO never changed, but
Mhm.
some of the facts surrounding it changed over time. So that's something you just have to take into consideration as you interview witnesses and you examine, the data.
Yeah, that's something that we, in my other field, one of my other fields, we know very well about, because even in light hypnosis, which is basically, especially if you're in a suggestible, highly suggestible state, because you've seen something that you did not expect, and that's enough to kind of like trigger that type of reaction. And then you have someone implying something else, and you pick up on the inference. In hypnosis, that's called confabulation. It's basically the implementation of a false memory. But because people are in this kind of states, you don't need a hypnotist to implement that memory. Just because someone repeated it to you, you begin to believe that, yes, yeah, actually, that makes more sense. This is
Yeah.
what happens. So this is a problem with this type of witness accounts. This is why I think we should find a mechanism in which all these accounts can be at some point reported and then analyzed by, I don't know, pilots, telescopes, satellites, so have a sort of a global system, centralized system in which we can analyze this type of accounts. Anything that, because in your book there are so many examples of so many studies and so many interesting things that are kind of anomalous to even what we have in the paper. Anything else that you want to share that was very, very odd
Well, let's
or
see.
unexplainable, let's say?
Right. I mean, there's a lot of, a lot of things that happen in some UFO reports that are extremely odd and unexplainable. So here's an example of one. I interviewed a husband and wife who had seen an object basically around the star Rigel, which is in the Orion
Right.
constellation. So in this case, what happened was every morning at about 4 in the morning, 5 in the morning, the husband and wife, they have their coffee. She goes out, to kiss him goodbye as he goes off to work. He works as a forest ranger. She's a math teacher at the local school. And so as they're outside, they always look at the stars because they enjoy looking at the stars. So both of them are pretty familiar with the constellations, planets and the major stars. So one night they're going out and he looks up at Orion and he says, "Well, look how bright Rigel is. I mean, it's like 2 or 3 orders of magnitude brighter than it should be." His wife looks at it and says, "Yes, it is. It is extremely bright." She, and then they discuss, well, how can that be? It's not a variable star. Hopefully, it's not going to nova, right, or something like that.
Very
And so,
educated people when it comes to looking at the
right,
stars.
they were aware of astronomy, and so she turns to do something else, and then he's still looking at it, and suddenly Rigel goes back to its normal brightness, and there's this little, very small, he thought it was disc shaped, but very small object, and it just orbits around Rigel a few times before it leaves and disappears. So it's almost like, um, in science you hate to say something like this, but it's almost like it was a demonstration to say, hey, look how Rigel looks, and now it's back to normal, and it was caused by me, right? But you get those kind of just strange cases like that that happen, throughout your study of this subject area. One thing that I talk about in the book that I wanted to mention at some point is the extraterrestrial hypothesis, which I discuss in the book, because I think it has changed a lot in the last 30 years. 30 years ago, we had not yet discovered any exoplanets. I think 1992 was the very first exoplanet that had been discovered. And that has changed drastically, where today there are over 6,000 exoplanets. And I would say we are within years, at the most, maybe a decade, of being able to analyze the chemical constituents in some of the exoplanets' atmospheres. And as we continue developing our science, we'll get better and better, where we can begin to see the smaller planets, the Earth-sized planets' atmospheres, right? So if you think about that and just reverse the role, someone out there looking at us, right? What would they have seen over the last 200 years if they had a telescope trained on us? And let's say their astronomy was maybe 50 years more advanced than we're at today. So they would have looked at the Earth, and in the 19th century, they would have started detecting complex hydrocarbons, right, from the Industrial Revolution. And so prior to that, they might have detected, right, a little methane, a little carbon dioxide, oxygen, nitrogen. And so they could have said, good possibility of life. And then the 19th century, our 19th century, it becomes clear, right, that there's likelihood of life. And then in about the year 1930, so another few decades, right, and their telescope's looking at our planet, and let's say it has a coronagraph so that it can block out the star's light so that they can actually see the backside of our planet. And they start seeing the wavelengths of incandescent light begin to show up, right? And so at that point in time, they know, okay, wait, how do we have a unique wavelength of light that's being emitted from the dark side of this planet? So they would begin to suspect that that was some species there has developed artificial lighting. So they keep watching our planet, and then in another 20 years, only 20 revolutions of this planet around its sun, and now they're detecting some bright flashes of light on occasion, right? Nuclear testing that we do above ground, and they're beginning to detect isotopes of plutonium and uranium in the atmosphere. So now they know, okay, we are looking at a civilization that has begun its development of nuclear power. And so at that point, the only question is, can they get here, right? And are they curious to get here? Because they would know we exist by then. And some people say, well, the vast distances of space, but already we are looking at interstellar travel. The Breakthrough Project, which began about 10 to 15 years ago, is using the concept of solar sails that you hit these solar sails with powerful lasers. And because the mass of your spacecraft, which would just be basically a computer chip, you're able to accelerate it to 20% of the speed of light in a matter of, I think, 15 minutes. And so what they would do is send these towards Alpha Centauri. And Alpha Centauri is only 4 light years away. So if you can travel at 20% of the speed of light, that means in 20 years, you can make it to the next star system. So we're already looking at those possibilities. So I don't think it's too far-fetched to realize that a more advanced civilization would have more capabilities than what we will have in the next 50 to 100 years.
And the other interesting thing is, because for me, I mean, personally, when I said I was reluctant, it wasn't necessarily because I think that the field is, too woo. I mean, after all, I'm also a hypnotherapist, so I already branched outside the dogmatic and very conventional sciences. But it was because I never submitted to the anthropocentric philosophy, let's call it, or model. So for me, the existence of extraterrestrial wasn't a question. It was almost like they were not even extraordinary enough, because I assumed that they exist, and I know how this sounds.
Right.
For me, the question was, how did they get here from the perspective of physics? But another interesting point to what you were saying, and how we would be observed from a different part of the, even our galaxy. The other thing is, we forget that space also means time. And I don't mean you and I mean in general, as humans, we forget that. And we forget the fact that some civilizations could have been in a part of the sky that was developed way, way earlier than ours. So they might have 100 years already of space travel, or 1,000 years of space travel, or 10,000 years of space travel. Because if we somehow got smarter around the 10,000 years ago, by now we would be somewhere else, you know? So
Yeah.
we think in terms of our civilization being the norm, but we don't have any evidence to say that that is the norm in the vastness of space-time. And again, with so many exoplanets, as you mentioned, I used to work in that institute, in that observatory, where they would put every week a new number. You know, that's where the Nobel Prize for exoplanets was. So they would change the number by 100 or something. You know. So this hypothesis is making more and more sense. It's interesting still, the physics, because the physics, I looked at, I mentioned before, like how I got an expert in how not to build a warp drive. I looked at so many models, and this is for anyone who's not a physicist, this is public service, caveat emptor. Be very careful. There are so many models out there that are claiming to have solved this problem. I have not seen anyone that has a serious claim. I think about actually combining some models of dark matter that have some intrinsic properties that create this type of Fermi pressure that can hold galaxies and all that. But again, we don't have these particles yet. So it doesn't help us much except at the theoretical level. But nevertheless, this type of studies and what you're looking at are very, very interesting, because they help not just with the physics, but also with, to some extent, the motivation and the intention of why they are here, especially when you start correlating them with the locations and where these reports are. And one interesting thing, coming back now to our perception, that I wanted to mention a little bit, is the time dilation. So you have in your book a couple of accounts that are talking about the time dilation and feeling like the time, like they got to the location and realized it's 2 hours late, and for them it was 5 minutes, or so on, or the opposite, because this is also an effect of some warping effects, even though it's hard for me to imagine that a human would still be alive to feel the time dilation if you have a warp drive that's so close to you. But I mean, maybe I'm missing something here. So yeah, tell us a little bit about.
Yeah, no, I've always wondered about the same thing you just mentioned, right? I mean, if someone could warp space, or what keeps everything around there from being sucked into that same wormhole, or whatever it happens to be. But yeah, there's been a number of witnesses where they see a craft, and so they're in close proximity to it. And one example was they're driving down the road, and the craft is just driving along, flying along next to them as they're going down the road. And then it leaves. So to them, it felt like it was only, a very short time. They get to their destination, and they realize several hours has gone by. And so it's like, what happened to that time? So if you would were to assume that when they were near the craft, that they were in a different space-time, right? So that time basically slowed down for them, but it was traveling, but time was moving at normal time for everyone around. So once the craft leaves and they're back into normal time, right? Much more time has gone by because time had stopped for them, or approached stopping when they were in the vicinity of this craft. But then then you have all these questions. Well, okay, there's a road, there's a distance from A to B, takes a certain time to get there. Where were they and what were they doing for 2 hours if if they were only 15 minutes away?
Yeah, that's one of the very interesting cases that I read in your book, because normally the first time we discussed about this, for me, it was a clear case of that type of traumatic experience that puts you in freeze. The time perception is not there, and is not just a traumatic experience. It can be anyone who's been in full anesthesia knows that when they come out, the time perception is different. Anyone who's been in hypnosis knows that the time perception is different. So any sort of different state in which you're in a kind of a trance gives you a different time perception. But in that case, you actually had a clock and you had a distance, and you can measure the time you were driving, so there's a very interesting case, because you can't say that it was just one of those times.
Yeah, because you wonder what did we do? Did we just drive around in a circle for an hour and then finally get to our destination? I mean, it's like, how could it take 2 hours to get there? Where were you during those 2 hours?
So I would advise everyone to check out the book. It's been very interesting for me. It complements perfectly the article, because it looks in more detail as some of these anomalous accounts. And you talk also about other groups of astronomers and physicists and so on that went and studied this type of phenomenon. And you also go through a series of logical fallacies, which that's a chapter that I loved, going through the logical fallacies of what scientists expect when you study such a field and such extraordinary quote unquote claims. And I want to talk a little bit now about where we're going and what's coming next. First of all, what's your ideal scenario for studying this object further down the line? And then we can talk also about your foundation and how we get over the stigma in academia, for example.
I think in my ideal situation is that Congress says, you know what, we need to study UAP, and it needs to be done by academia and the scientific community. And so Congress says, we are providing, let's say, $100 million per year towards grants that will be provided by the National Science Foundation, to various scientific groups and academic students that want to study the subject. But Congress needs to say that money is earmarked specifically to UAP, similar to what they've done with global warming, right? Money that's been earmarked towards that usage. And I think we'll make much more progress than we've made in the last 70 years, because the military has driven the understanding of UAP over the last 70 years. And as we know, because of the way they operate, I mean, this is just the way military has to operate, their information stays closed, hidden, and in silos, right? It's not like science where the information is open, and as you were saying earlier, others can read it, learn from it, build upon it, and continue to, gather more and more information. So I think if the money is appropriated, that science will begin to move towards it. And I could give you a good example. 30 years ago, they had what was called the Invisible College that J. Allen Hynek had created, right? And this was professors who were interested in the UFO subject, but they didn't want their name to be known because it would hurt their careers. So they were, they kept quiet and they just kind of worked together when they could. Well, today, you have organizations such as the SCU, which has over 300 members. 30% of those have PhDs. You have Galileo Project. You have the Soul Foundation. You have UAPX. And you have another organization called, the abbreviation is SWAPS. If I can remember it right, I believe it stands for the Society for UAP Studies. And they basically are putting together academic criteria and courses on the subject. So we've gone a long ways from where we were 30 years ago. So I think with money from Congress, we could go, things will really take off.
Yes, that's the hope. Any other projections, future projections on how to study this field? Or like projects, because I know you had this conference that SCU is organizing. Is it every year or every 2 years?
We have a conference every year.
So it's every year.
Sometimes we will alternate between a in-person conference and a virtual conference through the internet. But we have a conference every year except the year of COVID, when we had to, of course, cancel our conference. So usually at our conference, we bring together speakers and presenters out of academia that have scientific backgrounds and that study the subject in a scientific manner. And that's one of SCU's driving forces, which is to get everyone together, academia, the scientific community, to work on this subject and to realize the stigma needs to disappear, because this is a subject that really needs to be studied. Because if you make the assumption of the possibility that UFOs could be our chance at first contact, right, with another intelligence, where it comes from, we don't know. It would be sad that it's not the scientific world that's involved in that, and that instead it might be the military world, because I would much prefer it to be scientists and not military guys that make first contact, whenever that happens, whatever year it occurs.
And also that this is also the other side of the equation. If in parallel with understanding what this is and how it works, we build our own models of how to build something like that, like how to build such a mechanism. Yeah. You can have that. As you were saying, maybe it's better to have a global network of scientists that come up with these technologies, rather than have a very, I'm not saying that shouldn't be done also with the collaboration with the military, because some of these projects at some level, you're going to have to deal with the military. There's no way around it. Yeah. But it's a different thing when it comes from the scientific community. And the other thing is, because I know now we're discussing the Congress and all these other initiatives are discussing the defense side of this. If we are mature enough to say this is not coming from a different power than ours on the Earth, and I know at the beginning that was floated as a possibility, but now the more we look at this data, the more we know that there's no such capability on the planet. Then the only solution would be to have a completely global effort in which, first of all, you take the data reported everywhere in the world, right? And then you have scientists from everywhere in the world developing these type of models and looking at this data analysis and so on. So to me, this is the one of the fields that where we should definitely, be less territorial about it.
Oh, absolutely. I couldn't have said that better. I mean, just think about it. The more you have scientists that work together, my impression has always been the more the chances of peace and the more collaboration there is among the nations of the world. And communication always leads to better understanding and less, friction and war and everything else we do. So in a way, it's an opportunity for all nations to work together. And just let's just assume UFOs are something that has nothing to do with an intelligence or anything. Even if that was true, at the very least, at least we work together and we put together processes for how we would handle first contact someday, whenever that day happens. So there's a lot to be gained by not being, as you said, and I always have problems with this word, anapus. How did you say it again? Sinziana, here you are, not a native English speaker, and you can
I
say it
said
better than I can.
territorial, less territorial.
Well, yeah, but when you're human centric,
Anthropocentric.
yes, thank you, anthropocentric. But if we
Well,
could
it's
just
it's not an English word at origin, so that's why.
well, yeah, true. But if we could just not be anthropocentric, I think we could learn a lot more, right? And just realize we are not the center of everything.
And also the other thing for me is that would be ideal. I understand that, I mean, different fields need to get big projects and focus on their projects, but I would, in my utopia, I would envision a more creative interdisciplinary dialogue on the topic. Because as we talked about during the podcast, and also as you say in the book, there are so many aspects to this issue. We need not just physicists and engineers and
Biologists
and so on. We need also behavioral scientists, and we need people who know, for example, biofeedback and neurofeedback to see what differences are in a person after such an encounter, even if it's just for the follow-up with the person, and that it has nothing to do with UAPs. We know so many accounts in history in which whatever happened had an effect, like those children that in the movie Ariel, had an effect on their development after. So it's to some extent, it's also like a mental health issue for some of these people who have this experience. And I don't say it, again, from my perspective, in no way in a pejorative sense. It's a very important part of this study. So there are so many things that we should put together in the analysis of such perception and memory and sensory perception, and also like radar and radiation and all these kind of fields. If we work together, the progress would be way, way faster.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, it involves theology. I mean, it just involves all the scientific subjects. I mean, the closest I can think to this would be global warming, right? Because you have a lot of sciences involved in trying to solve this global warming problem.
And to me, it's consciousness. Consciousness is another one, because again,
yes, I agree. Yeah, consciousness.
Quantum physics to computational science to biology to NLP and behavioral science and psychology is covered in that field.
Yeah.
And yet we don't talk to each other.
Exactly.
That's a pun on consciousness, Okay, thank you so much, Robert, for having this conversation with us. I'm looking forward to the next one because I know that the topic is so extensive that we're definitely going to be speaking soon about this. And I look forward to see what's the next article about and what more can we learn from this field and from you and from your work. And for everyone else, I'm going to share this screen one more time. Go buy this book and yes, go buy this book and then read the article. Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Robert Powell.
Thank you, Sinziana. I really enjoyed our conversation.